Richard. Thank you for coming over. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to try in the next 20 minutes or so to clean up a little bit the mess of this afternoon and the discussion around the rotors, because we have collected a data set that tries to directly compare phase map and the filtering that is required in order to do a phase map analysis. And we compare this to direct contact mapping, and that may be helpful in understanding quite some of the questions we discussed earlier this afternoon. This here is my disclosure slide, nothing too relevant to the topic of rotors. The company Eurythmics has been founded, but this is not related to rotor activity or other things. This is just a slide showing the basic principle of the firm approach. I think I can actually go through this very quickly. What Sanjeev Narayan does is he records endocardial electrograms from the left and from the right atrium, and then those electrograms are filtered in a special way. This is related essentially to the shape of the action potential, and then a so-called phase analysis is done, and then this produces such movies here where phase singularities are detected. Those are the rotor cores actually, and when atrial fibrillation, or when those cores are ablated, atrial fibrillation may in some cases terminate. Rotors are also seen with a completely different technique, and that's interesting to see, of course, that also a technologically completely different approach can actually produce rotors. And this is the ECG imaging. Karl-Heinz Cook explained already what this roughly is. This is a technique that was developed by Yoram Rudy a couple of years ago. Essentially, the individual anatomy is compared or is combined with body surface potential maps, and from this you can reconstruct the conduction pattern in the heart, also during atrial fibrillation to a certain extent, and when you do this also rotors become visible during atrial fibrillation again, and this here is work from Michel Hassaguer's group and Pierre Yaï's group. And when the areas where those rotors preferentially occur are ablated, also this may sometimes terminate atrial fibrillation. This is not really a very nice representative example, because usually what they show is that those rotors, and that's a different with what we see in the work of Sanjeev Narayan, those rotors really move through the atrium, and the targets are the areas where those rotor cores more likely appear. I have a confession to make, and I think that Karl-Heinz already mentioned a couple of things. I never understood how it can possibly be that the ablation in the center of a rotor would terminate atrial fibrillation. This is, for me, very hard to understand. This is a relatively stable rotor here. There are rotors that are much more meandering through a substrate. When you ablate this in the center, you can, if the ablation is relatively small, you can still get temporary detachment, but still already this here stabilizes the rotor pretty much. If the ablation is larger, then you get simply very stable rotation around this obstacle. So it is impossible to explain by this intervention that, or to explain how this intervention could actually stop atrial fibrillation, I think. And I have another very significant problem with those techniques, and that is also something that Karl-Heinz Cook already mentioned, and that is this enormous difference in the complexity of the arrhythmia. This is from the firm approach. Here you can see examples of the fibrillation waves during atrial fibrillation reconstructed in a patient with persistent atrial fibrillation. And with what you see in here is a small plug electrode sized approximately how the electrode we usually use looks like, also in a patient with persistent atrial fibrillation, and you see this enormous difference in complexity, at least factor 10, if not factor 100. And also you see here how those fibrillation electrograms actually look like in the posterior wall of the left atrium, and this, in my eyes, is not very consistent with these very, very large waves that are visible in the ECG imaging approach. We come from a different tradition also in the analysis of atrial fibrillation. we very much believe that it is still, even after the introduction of phase mapping into the world of electrophysiology, possible to analyze electrograms, fibrillation electrograms, based on the actual annotation of activation time. It's nowadays a little bit the tendency to say that this is not possible anymore. Why shouldn't something not be possible anymore if we did it for a couple of decennia in a successful way? I don't understand this either. So what we do is we have those uniform electrograms, and we identify large deflections. From those, we extract certain properties: atrial fibrillation cycle lengths, local conduction velocity, tortuosity of waves, and from this we calculate what of the other deflections actually would reflect local activations. And we are not saying that this is the only way to interpret fibrillation electrograms, but it is the most likely one based on the properties we actually extract. From this approach, we also, when the discussion about the rotor started, tried to find out how much rotation we actually see during atrial fibrillation in our animal models as well as in patients with atrial fibrillation. And we sometimes do see rotating waves. Like here, for instance, this is a rotating wave. It shows a 360-degree turning approximately. But this does not happen very often. Only a very small percentage of the fibrillation waves we see show a clear turn by 360 degrees. And we have quantified this in our animal models in patients. It's a little bit cycle length dependent. The shorter the cycle length is, the more rotation you would see. But overall, there is not a clear difference between patients in persistent or paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, or sheep or goats or whatever you look at. It's approximately 1 to 2, maybe 3% of all fibrillation waves that show more than one rotation, but not more than that. So we thought a couple of years ago, well, if we want to keep talking to the world of phase mapping, we have to introduce this in the repertoire of our algorithms, and we did this. And I would like to explain you a little bit on what actually phase mapping does. Instead of looking at a function as the result of time, you can also look at the angle of the point of this member of this function if you would project it on a circle. So each of those data points is projected on this circular curve, and then you look at the angle between this point and the center as compared to a certain baseline. And this angle will, of course, increase to 360 degrees, and then at a certain reference line, there will be a phase transition. And for very strictly periodic phenomena, this absolutely makes sense. Like, for instance, time. We do not describe time from the Big Bang on. That would not be practical, but we agreed that at midnight there's a phase shift, and then a new day starts. So this makes sense, but it only makes sense if you have strictly periodic phenomena. A unipolar or also a bipolar electrogram during atrial fibrillation is not such a strictly periodic phenomenon. You see that there is fractionation. Fractionation increases with the degree of remodeling and with increasing complexity of atrial fibrillation. This here is a unipolar electrogram in a patient with paroxysmal, and this here in persistent atrial fibrillation. If you would use the phase analysis directly on this signal, you can do that essentially, but then you end up with such a signal here. You see a lot of phase transitions, and of course the phase transitions are seen as the moment of the activation, and if you do that, you see very short cycle lengths, you see a very irregular pattern, and of course this is not a very meaningful analysis of this electrogram. So there is consensus, there is not a lot of consensus, but there is a little bit of consensus in this world, and that is the fact that in order to do a meaningful phase analysis of an electrogram, you have to filter those electrograms heavily. You can do this with a frequency filter. You can do this with a spatial filter. That actually doesn't matter that much, but you have to filter them. We use a sinusoidal recomposition because that has some advantages. It is a very clear and well-defined form of filtering that gives you a very narrow frequency band in the signal. That's what you want when you do a phase analysis. And if you then repeat the phase analysis, the signal looks actually pretty good. So, and the phase transitions also reflect the moments of activation pretty well. This is what Karl-Heinz Cook also showed this afternoon. So those techniques do not that much disagree with each other, yet the complexity, of course, is much, much smaller. Now, this is the workflow we have established. So we do the direct contact mapping on the epicardial surface of the atria in patients undergoing open chest surgery. We then take the unipolar electrograms and do the traditional activation time annotation. And then we look at the conduction velocity, the conduction times, and we group the activations in waves, and we define lines of conduction block in order to separate different waves. This is here an isochronal map and a wave map in the same picture, and this is kind of the image or the representation of the electrical activation we get then. What we then added is the filter step by sinusoidal recomposition, as well as the Hilbert transform. This is a certain mathematical way to calculate instantaneous phase, and this is the phase signal. And then in the phase map, you look at so-called phase singularities, because that's the actual purpose behind doing a phase analysis. You are interested in finding phase singularities. A phase singularity means that all the different phases of the cycle come together in one point. Because if you have such a situation where all the phases, all the colors you see here, come together in this point here, this is a phase singularity, and that means that a wave is rotating there. Phase singularity means rotor. Now, this phase singularity here is sitting on something we traditionally would call a conduction block line. That was something we noticed very early in this process. Now, have a look at this example. This is not a representative example at all. It is the nicest rotor we have ever seen in our database of the recordings, in this case here in the posterior wall of the left atrium. The first thing you see that it looks very nice. It is simply a very beautiful thing to look at, and you know there is literature and knowledge about the relation between pattern recognition and aesthetic perceptions, so that may already be a psychological substrate towards rotors. But anyhow, when I run this now again, I would like to ask you to have a look at two different aspects of this. One is that the phase singularity you see here is sitting on a line of block, and the other thing is, of course, that the entire perception of the entire process is changing a lot. This here is the phase singularity, this circle here, this always means phase singularity, and it's sitting on this block line you see here. And of course, the entire perception is clearly changed. The sequence of activation is changed, and the entire appearance is very much different. And this, of course, is due to the massive filtering of those electrograms. But the massive filtering is necessary, otherwise we couldn't do a phase analysis of those electrograms. That filtering changes our perception is something we know already for a long time. This here is a picture of the former president of the United States, but we have made this picture in a very special way. It contains two layers of information. And when we now spatially filter this image, then you will see that although we did not change at all the actual content, we did not change the actual content of this image. We simply look at it from a larger distance. But this changes our perception to an extent that it couldn't be more different. And this simply has to do with the spatial filtering of this information. Now, this is highly relevant to our understanding of rotors, because we as electrophysiologists also often filter information when we look at it. We often spatially filter it when we look at the activation of the heart. And one very basic example of this is the surface ECG. This is a slide, actually Sander made this slide. It's a slide we show the students when we explain to them the ECG. And the summation vector occurring during the activation of the heart is actually a representation of such a filter step. It's it's a representation of spatial filtering of all the small dipoles occurring during the activation of the heart, and then this is projected on lead 1 here in this specific example. So the summation vector is an example of how you could spatially filter electrical activation. And now I would like to do together with you a thought experiment. No actual data here, it's just a scheme. Let's use the filtering by the summation vector as a method to see what happens due to filtering with our perception of a conduction pattern where a block line is involved. This here is a block line, and this is our point of interest. It could be anywhere on this block line. Here in this case it's in the middle of this line of block. So when now this area is activated, and here the depolarization front enters from the top, you will see that there is a small summation vector. It points, just as we explain this to our students, always towards the mass that is still to be activated. This is how we usually explain this to the students. And it's still small because the depolarization front is still far away and the electrotonic effect is still small. But when the depolarization front approaches the point of interest, it becomes larger. And now I think you see what I'm trying to say. This vector is starting to turn. And it makes a 90% turn when the entire part on the left side is actually fully activated. And it will continue to turn when the repolarization starts. And it will further turn when also the right side is now activated, but this time from below, not from the upper part of this field of interest. And when then in the end also the right part is fully repolarized, the vector will have made a 360-degree turn. And now imagine what happens during atrial fibrillation. During AF, you often have this phenomenon of linking. One fibrillation wave tends to follow the path of the preceding wave. This simply has to do with the sequence of regaining excitability. So I could imagine that during atrial fibrillation, it could happen once in a while, or maybe also often, that you can have a situation that two different waves activate an area along a line of block, and the timing is such that because of the repetitive pattern, you get repetitive turning of the extracellular dipole. And depending on the filtering, depending on the algorithm, that's what you may see as a rotor. Now, can we substantiate this? We first did modeling. Here we have the advantage that we can create any pattern of conduction we want to have. Those models can actually also simulate the changes of the extracellular potential. So we have here a line of block. We have two waves that activate this area. And here in the middle, we have an area where we look at the extracellular electrograms. And those electrograms are then taken to do filtering and to the Hilbert transport, and we can do the phase analysis of this signal. And this here is the result. You see here the actual activation pattern, just two waves passing by, conducting along this line of block. And this happens when you smooth out the picture, when you subject it to filtering, and when you do the phase analysis. And the computer clearly identifies here that there is a phase singularity, which means that in this area, all the different phases come together in one point. So this is a phase singularity. So here the algorithm would say, hey, there is a rotating wavefront. And this can even be stable. Look at this here. This is the movie. And this circle here means that in this point, during this time, the criterion of a phase singularity is actually met. So although we know exactly how the actual conduction pattern looks like, a line of block, two independent waves, the computer algorithm clearly tells us there is a rotating wave. Then we went back to our patients, 21 patients, 12 with paroxysmal, 9 in persistent atrial fibrillation. We looked at 10-second recordings at the posterior left atrial wall and also in the right atrium. And we did, on the very same electrograms, of course, the traditional activation time-up approach with no filtering, traditional activation time annotation, and we detected block lines and thus fibrillation waves. And on the other hand, using the same material, we looked at the phase analysis with filtering, with the Hilbert transform as the method to calculate instantaneous phase, and we detected the rotor using the usual phase singularity detection algorithm that is also implemented in all those systems. Topera system, ECGI, Cardio Insight, EP solution, they all work with phase singularities to detect rotors. Now here again, this example, this phase singularity seen here is clearly sitting here on this line of block. And please notice that indeed, I fully agree with Karl-Heinz Cook, the overall pattern of the activation is actually not that much different. It looks pretty similar, but because of the smoothing, because of the filtering, because of the way phase singularities are detected, a rotating wave is detected here. And this is not only a little bit of pivoting here, no, it's really a long line of block, which is a couple of centimeters long. And we found this again and again, here and here and here and here, always long lines of block, sometimes even multiple lines of block involved, but usually it's just one, like in this example, again, a couple of centimeter block, and this produces a phase singularity. This is the actual quantitative analysis. We looked at the distance between the rotor core, the phase singularity, and the block line, and in more than 90% of the phase singularities we found, and we found 138 phase singularities in all those recordings of those patients together. The distance between the rotor and the line of block was smaller than 3 millimeters. That's really not a lot, less than 3 millimeters. What does this all mean? I think it means that rotors identified by phase analysis of filtered electrograms do not per se represent an actual conduction pattern. It looks like this because we see that something moves, and we tend to believe moving pictures and images a lot because the perception is so immediate, so direct. But it is not a conduction pattern. It is simply showing turning of the extracellular dipole at a line of block. And therefore, I believe that many rotors, at least the rotors identified by phase analysis of filtered electrograms, can be seen as markers for conduction block. Now, this may sound strange, but let's give the thought a chance, because I think that if we accept this, we can explain a couple of things better that we previously did not understand very well, and points that we actually discussed about this afternoon. We can understand now that rotors are sometimes found close to ablation lines. How would you otherwise understand? A rotor arm cannot go through an ablation line unless the ablation line is not really good. And we believe that Karl-Heinz is very well knowing what he is doing. It is because this is a conduction block line. This is why you see this rotor there. We can also understand, and we haven't seen data this afternoon, but I can tell you that there is a lot of research currently showing that in the transition zone between fibrosis and normal tissue, you very often see rotors. And this, again, I think is due to the fact that there is a block line there, because certainly those areas are prone to conduction block. And last but not least, couldn't we then also understand that ablation of regions that tend to anchor rotors, at least temporarily, can sometimes terminate atrial fibrillation? Because regions that preferentially anchor rotors occurrence may simply reflect areas that are prone to conduction block, that contribute to the increased stability of atrial fibrillation because they increase the complexity of AF. And those areas here identified by preferential occurrence of rotors by Michel Assaguer may reflect areas that are prone to conduction block, that during the fibrillatory process increase the complexity of atrial fibrillation. And when you then ablate them, this may, maybe not always, but sometimes terminate atrial fibrillation. This is what I wanted to share with you today, and I would like to thank Piotr Pociemski, a young, very intelligent gentleman who did most of this work, and Steph Semering and Pavel Kuklik. They have programmed all this, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to work with them. Thank you very much.
Ulrich, I've seen that talk before, and I am absolutely convinced that you are correct. The similarities with these maps to the old non-contact maps and the response to ablation, which was nothing, absolutely convinces me. The further you zoom out, the more you're likely to see this activation. And in fact, Boon Lim from St Mary's has done some really nice maps with rhythmia, showing exactly the same effect, that if you do a really high density map, you can show rotors, but actually it's a macro re-entry circuit round conduction block that produces that appearance. Right. I'm convinced.
Uli, beautiful, as always, very beautiful. I was sitting here and thinking, even during Karl-Heinz's talk, why are we trying to block it by, or terminate by increasing more lines of block? Why don't we try, and I don't know if you have tried that, but maybe you can simulate it in the simulation that you've done before. What would happen if you would send, at the right point in time, and maybe you can tell me it's hard to find the right point in time, another wave front that just hits this wave and terminates it? So in other words, you could probably see when the refractoriness is not yet there, and you could actually just block it. Is that a way of, coming from a completely different angle, not to destroy more, but to guide the properly timed extra? In other words, could we, by timing an extra at the right point, terminate AF by pacing?
Well, actually, that is an entrainment strategy during atrial fibrillation that has been tried, but the problem is that with the increasing complexity of atrial fibrillation, the area that you can successfully entrain becomes very small, probably because the complexity becomes larger, the waves become smaller, and the excitable gap that you need for that is short. But most of the re-entry during atrial fibrillation is functional, which means that certainly in the presence of a high complexity, you have a pretty high chance that there is somewhere a wave close by which will already do the job for you, but then not in a controlled way. So I don't know whether this could work. I rather think that there can be regions that are prone to conduction block that cause wave break, that increase complexity of atrial fibrillation, kind of comparable to how a VT ablation sometimes can work, that you have an area that has small channels that produce delay of conduction, and when you would eliminate that, this may terminate AF. Not in all cases, but maybe sometimes.
So when you look in your data, I'm sure you have the occasional opportunity to see a spontaneous termination of AF. I would be so keen to know what happens when it terminates on its own without you interfering at all. What is making it to stop? Is it wave break, as you just said? Is it another break that breaks against that dominant wave, or is it, what is it?
It's a disbalance between the generation of new waves and fusion of waves, because there is a continuous process of fusion between waves, but there is also a continuous process of wave break and generation of new waves. And when the conditions are such that waves fuse more and more, you get a fewer number of waves, you get a wider excitable gap, AF slows down, and then it stops. But that is only a process you see immediately before cardioversion. It doesn't happen very often during AF.
I've seen it also before, and I saw new things again now. Why do this tedious singularity phase mapping? Why would you do that if you could do also just wave mapping, as you have shown? Eventually, if you had enough so this point of singularity, if you then you could draw an electroanatomic map of all lines. So, but maybe you have to map them for days, and eventually you would find the paths which you classically find.
Yeah. Well, this is not done because we in the scientific community do not agree on how you would identify the local moment of activation. It is very hard to find an agreement there. You know, and of course there are people who have done this for many, many years, like Maurits. You know, for him it is very clear, yeah, you just do it, and then here and there you have to edit this a little bit. You know, but if you talk to Pepe Khalife, who was never exposed to highly fractionated electrograms where it becomes a difficult job, he wouldn't easily agree. Or if you then talk to Alvaldo, he says, algorithms? Agreeing on what is a line of block or what is the minimal conduction delay in order to define a line of block? I don't care, I just sit there and then I annotate the activation times. That's what he is doing. So what we try now, right now, in Chicago, we are going to sit together again, is to come up with a list of agreements and definitions. And it starts with very simple things. What is block during AF? Is it a minimal conduction velocity of 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters? Should we get rid of this? Should we always explain every phenomenon based as a function of the actual threshold for a block? Well, that's a lot of work. But, you know, so it looks easy here, but it is difficult. And when complexity meets impact, you know what happens. And that's what we are seeing here. So what question?
Of course.
Thank you, Uli, for this very fascinating presentation. I had more a methodological question because I was wondering, I was looking at the phase signal, and it seems like it depends on the number of positive deflections in your electrogram signal. So I was wondering whether your phase map is affected by small variations in heart frequency in the patient.
Yes, absolutely. In the way that the window of filtering, if you do a frequency-based filtering, then the window of filtering has to go along with the frequency. Because if you don't do that, then you will actually miss the actual activations. Mm-hmm. So the answer is clearly yes. And the filtering you do has, if it is a frequency filtering, and that is a pretty intuitive way to filter signal, it has to be around the target frequency. So you need to have an idea on the frequency you want to look at. But we know how fast atrial fibrillation is. Mm-hmm. So if one thing we know, then we know, you know, atrial fibrillation cycle length is something we can very robustly determine.